Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on state-of-the-art cybersecurity architecture in the finance industry. I'm very happy that Mark Behrens is joining me today, who is an absolute expert when it comes to cybersecurity in the finance industry. Mark was the former head of the Tier 1 SOC of Rabobank. He then joined UBS as their head of Global Security Operations Center, and he has now founded his own security consultancy company, Prusec. My name is David Gugelmann. I'm a former researcher from ETH Zurich and CEO and founder of Exeon Analytics. Exeon is specialized in network detection response. Among others, 2 of the top 5 Swiss banks are among our customers. Today's webinar consists of 2 parts. In the first part, Mark will introduce the NIST framework. In particular, he will focus on the corresponding requirements on the detection function and present different implementations of a SIEM solution. In the second part, our threat analyst, Philip Loy, will execute the life hack to show how cyber attackers can break into a corporate network, and we will also demonstrate how a state-of-the-art network detection response solution can detect such an attack. If you have any questions, please post them in our chat. Mark and I will answer them at the end of the webinar. That's all from my side for the moment. The floor is yours, Mark.
Thank you, David. I'll take over the screen and start my presentation here. That works. Takes a little. Share. It's always interesting to see that it works when you do the live session. It takes a little bit to start the sharing.
Yeah, it does take a bit of time on my side, so I think that's just a feature of the tool, let's say like that.
Let's do it like that. Have you stopped sharing on your side, David?
I did, yeah, so you should be able to share.
It says it's sharing, but I don't see the result for the audience yet. So we wait a little.
Maybe stop sharing again and then start again. This is what we also had at some point with another participant.
That's a typical Morphe effect.
Otherwise, what I can suggest is that I take over slide sharing and you just tell me when to move forward.
That's good. Let's do it that way.
Okay, give me a second. Okay, I'm about to start sharing now. There we are.
Perfect. Thank you, David, for that. Let me do that. Yeah, we kicked off already. Welcome, everybody. David introduced me already a bit. I'm the owner and founder of a company called Prusec. I am independent security consultant based on over 15 years experience in the cybersecurity market and especially in the finance industry, and over 20 years experience in the finance industry. So with that, I founded the company to support other companies, other banks in building up and ensuring and maturing their security posture. David, if you can go to the next slide, please. Prusec is a small company, currently officially 4 FTE, 4 people working here, not full-time all. And we deliver consulting along the NIST cybersecurity framework. Meaning that we, for the people who know the NIST framework, you see the 5 functions on the top of it, on the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So the left side of the NIST framework is normally more covered by CISOs in the normal governance, the risk management, and that kind of things. In the middle part, protect, detect, respond, there's definitely where the security operations centers come in. They play a role in protecting, detecting, and respond to events. And the recovery, and that has an overlap with respond, of course. The crisis management team comes in play to make sure that your business runs in the end. We use the NIST cybersecurity framework to plot our services because we believe that that framework is relatively simple. It's well thought. It is simple. It's good to understand. You can add it. You can plot it on large firms, but also on smaller firms. And that makes it very useful for people to get a good coverage on their cybersecurity state. David, if you go to the next slide, please. I will show you why this helps in the financial market. Yeah. In 2008, here in Switzerland, the FINMA created a circular called Operational Risk Banks for banks. And that was quite a big document. It's purely about operational risk, not only about cyber. And there is one chapter in that document which talks about cybersecurity. And FINMA presented 5 points where you need to pay attention to. So they talk about identifying the threats for your company, for your bank. And they have a point where they say you need to protect your business from any cyber attacks on availability, integrity, and confidentiality. And you need to timely discover and react to cyber attacks. And as a last point, point E, they say you need to make sure that you can restore your business services once you haven't had an attack. That means that you will have some plans, you have some training, you have some exercises to do that. And if you go to the next slide, David, thanks, then you will see that these 5 points that FINMA mentioned in 2008 map perfectly well on the NIST CSF. And that might be a coincidence. It's not the case that FINMA used the NIST CSF at that time, because in 2008, the CSF was non-existing. NIST CSF is established in 2014 as a result, where the FINMA did the circular already in 2008. So I would rather say that the FINMA and other regulations in the finance industry in this world has inspired NIST to come up with that framework. And for today's session, I like to focus on the middlest column, the function detect, and talk a little bit about my experience about implementing detection capabilities. And that is a long history for me. If you go to the next slide, David. Thanks. In 2008, I started to be part of a project to implement an SIEM. And that's quite a long time ago, 13 years ago. Our approach there was to collect all the data from all the servers, from all the network components, so your firewalls, your proxies, your web caches, and all the components you have, even the routers which we're collecting. And then we're going to look into that big database for suspicious activities. And if you realize that we set a retention time for the data of 12 months, you can think that we have quite some data collected over there. So the initial results of this project were not so successful. If you go one slide further, David, I'll show you a little bit. We had slightly a bit of data overload. One too far, David. There is a little bit of data overload because you collect so much data of so many endpoints and you keep that for 12 months. That database goes so big. So the cost for licensing and the cost for storage of all the data was quite high. We ended up with a very big bunch of data where it was very hard to find suspicious activity because we didn't know exactly how that would look like in that case. So we changed that approach a bit, and I think in 2011, and that's on the next slide, we took a new project to implement a new SIEM implementation, also changed the vendor there. In this case, we learned from the past. So we started with defining use case. What kind of suspicious activity do we want to detect in this case? And what does that mean? And only if you have defined that kind of use cases, an administrator logging in to a system where he doesn't need to work on, for instance, you want to have only logs of that kind of activities. So we only collected specific logs for the use cases we had defined. And that worked out a bit better. David, can you flip one further? Yeah. Our data set was way smaller. That means also the costs were way lower for licensing and storage. But we had definitely better quality on the use cases. There was still quite high number of false positives in these use cases, as it's quite hard to do use case building and good correlations between the different instances. And as an example, what I always like to use, I would like to know if an administrator logs in out of office hours on a system if there is no change plan. And that is a very easy correlation if you talk about it. But if you want to build that correlation rule, an administrator logging in is quite good to see. You can get your logs from the AD environment, see who logs in, see at what time, and even if the time zone is depending, because you work probably with different time zones if you work in enterprises. You can still determine that he logs in outside office hours or in the weekend. But how do you make that match if there is a change ongoing? That means you need to have a connection to your system where you manage your changes, your ETL processes, probably your ITSM or ServiceNow tool, and start to make correlations. And there it's becoming very hard to do that programming in the SIEM tool. So the logic works. The false positive ratio could definitely be better, but it was definitely a better approach and a better success to the first implementation of a SIEM solution. 3 years later, in 2014, and if you flip to the next one, yeah, there we have it. We took a different approach for a new SIEM solution. We definitely took a risk-based approach, and risk-based focused on the business applications. We set up a small team of use case development that were effectively 2 or 3 people doing that work. One person who has an extreme good knowledge of all kind of cyber attacks and how you would see that in an environment like that. So what kind of events would you experience if that pops up? One guy who could very well in programming in that particular SIEM tool at that time, and one guy who has a good understanding of the business, and together with the risk officer of the business line, we were defining the use cases for them together with them. And that turned out in very good results. We had quite a bunch of use cases for business applications. We worked pretty well together with the business. So, David, if you can flip to the results there. The true positive ratio of the use cases was quite good because it was so specific to that application. And of course, it takes time to build all these use cases. But in this case, we focused really on business sites. And of course, we still had to do the core infrastructure monitoring over there. But that is a bit, it was more a side step for us. The main focus was on the business. And what was a key success factor for me there was always to have a discussion with the business and ask them what to do if an event pops up outside their business hours. So what happens what we're going to do if it happens on a Saturday or a Friday afternoon, or especially the Friday afternoon before a long weekend like Easter. In that case, we had the definition of pre-approved changes. We were allowed to do some changes to an application or even bring an application down under certain conditions and with specific actions over there. That means if we would take out an application because we really think that there's something malicious going on, we were allowed to take it down, inform the business line immediately, and take 1 hour of research to find a solution and really think if it's malicious or not. And that way we were prepared with the business to take out things and to do a lot of proper detections. And if you go to the next slide, David. Yeah, thanks. For me, that brought me a bit about thinking in today's situation. We're 7 years further again. How many SIEM solutions do you know, and how would you implement that? My experience with SIEM solutions is that the log management is definitely very high maintenance, and you need to cover all your systems. The IT landscape will change. New servers come on, old servers go away. A log source can change his format due to an update of the application. If a server or whatever stops logging to your SIEM solution, how do you detect that? That's quite a high maintenance. And the second case is that the use case development is quite complex and time intensive and specific to your applications. It makes it hard to do, especially for smaller companies. You probably don't have the people over there. You don't have the skill set in-house to do it. Because the last point over here, what I mentioned, is that finding the right people to do building the use cases and also finding the right people to operate these tools is, even for the big banks, quite a big challenge. It is hard to find these people. We all know that we have a lack of enough people in the cybersecurity space, and that is valid for everybody. It is so hard to get this team running. So going to a next slide, that brings me to a question: is a SIEM dead then these days? And because there's hard work to do, there's hard to get the people, it's costly. So is it dead or not? Well, I don't think it's really that, but there are some other solutions on the market nowadays, how you would do that. And David, if you flip one, I would add 2 more capabilities or tool sets, what you want to have. The EDR, the endpoint detection and response tooling, and the network detection and response tooling on side of the SIEM. And with an EDR, I would monitor the biggest chunk of your infrastructure. So monitor your workstations, monitor laptops, monitor servers. The NDR can cover the network, of course, and then in SIEM, you use that to fill gaps. That means on applications where you cannot have an EDR agent. If you're a bank and you run a SWIFT system, for instance, you're not allowed to put an EDR agent on that system, but you need to do some monitoring around SWIFT systems. That's mandatory. So in that case, you still rely on the SIEM solution. You might also have devices in your infrastructure, IoT devices, where you cannot even place a EDR agent. In that case, you also rely on SIEMs. So I think that an EDR would cover about 60% roughly of your infrastructure, and the NDR covers another 30%. So if you're a small company and you start now with security monitoring, or you start from scratch over, I would not start with a SIEM solution in the first place. I would start from left to right, starting with an EDR, getting the most bucks for your money, and implement a tool like that to have a good coverage and to have a good response capability. And the same is valid for NDRs, where it covers the network and it comes with predefined use cases. And sometimes I call NDRs a bit SIEM in a box. It comes with predefined use cases, predefined scenarios, and the options to respond also to these capabilities. Whereas SIEM is if you program it correctly, you can detect things, but the response goes normally not over the SIEM, but direct in other tools like your firewalls, your proxies, your endpoints. That's where you need to handle that. So the newer tools comes in there. One thing is a bit odd for the SOC analyst. They get free tools now instead of one tool where they had to work in the past. And of course, the SOC has more tools than the SIEM only. They already flooded with tools. But if you add 2 more complex tools like EDR and NDRs to it, their number of screens that they need to have will increase also. The option to forward EDR events and NDR events to a SIEM is not my favorite, but this is more favorite for me. adding a new technology, SOAR, security orchestra, automation and response tooling, and there are a bunch of them out of there. But they give you the option to bring all these things together. And one of the big benefits of a SOAR, in my view, is that you can create playbooks. In the past time, the first SIEM implementation I talked about, we had playbooks written in Word. And if you really have an incident, and that incident is handled by a SOC operator, he's not going to read a Word document at that time. He's doing the trick, he's doing his duty on the tool because he knows what he needs to do. At least that's his opinion. The SOAR tool can help you there definitely with predefined steps in a playbook. And they leave enough space for you to be flexible in there because every incident changes a little bit. But it's definitely handy to have that guided step through an incident and where to go. And another option which you can use in a SOAR is the orchestra or automation function. And for me, the difference between orchestra and automation is that I look at automation as within one tool, and orchestra goes over different tools. So for instance, if your EDR detects a malicious activity on an endpoint and you see that in your SOAR, you might be able to create a playbook where your SOAR then blocks a specific website on your proxy where this malicious someone is mentioning indeed that DDRs and NDR I think what I've seen in the last years is that the support from the vendors on tuning these systems so if I jump a little bit further than this, yeah, go on, David. Yeah. If I would start from scratch or rethink things or start in a new company where I need to implement security monitoring, I would start to think about what are my goals in monitoring. Audio sketchy for some people. I hope it works. It's a bit hard to change anything on the audio, I see. Sorry for that. If you start over, if you start from a green field, define your monitoring goals. And if you have, as everybody has, limited budget and what you want to do, think about where you spend that money and what tool fits where best. And as I said before, I would start, if I have nothing in place, I would start with an EDR because that gives me a very good coverage on your infrastructure, on your servers, your endpoints, and it gives you a response capability. If you have the option to add an NTA, that combination covers for me roughly 90% of your infrastructure, with the exception of very specific situations, specific banking applications, or more detailed things which EDRs or NDRs cannot do. And in SOAR, if you implement that, and it is a complex implementation source, it can remind me a little bit of the first SIEM implementations. You might struggle with similar types of issues over there, but it can help you to be faster. And in the past years, in my SOC, people were dealing with malware, machines that were infected with malware. They need to create an image from the memory, do a dump over there, and that takes time. It's about, say, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but it's waiting time for them. They cannot pick up anything else, so they just sit there and wait. If a tool can do that, because every time you have a malware alert, you want to have that image, the tool can do that already and present you all the evidence you need to do your analysis in order to go forward. So in that case, SOAR helps to speed up your response and make the incident response faster and also a bit more consistent. You have less dependency on the person who is operating it because it follows a more structured playbook. and it can guide the less experienced people through the same incidents, and they can learn on that. And bottom line, what it also does, it reduces a lot of the boring tier 1 work. You can automate quite a lot of things over there. So having that said, I think that is the main view what I have now on implementing security monitoring, the different tools you have over there, the different capabilities you have over there, and think wisely how you would do that. David, there's one slide left, I guess. And that is, if it's good, thank you to everybody to listening to it. And I hope that the audio is good enough to hear this. Later on in the session, after the demo from David, we have a Q&A where we can answer questions and have some other topics for you to address. I hope this was interesting for you, and thanks for listening. David,
thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks a lot. So it was definitely interesting for me. And as I said, there's already quite some activity in the chat. Please go ahead and just post your questions. We will handle them at the end of the webinar. So let's jump into the second part now. And the second part is, as already announced before, we will do live hacking just to basically show you what it's all about and also how easy it is actually to get into networks. And we will also demonstrate how you can detect such a thing based on network log data. Before I go into more details, let me also give a bit of background on Exeon, because it also explains a bit the approach which we take. So Exeon is a spin-off of ETH Zurich. In particular, we have our roots at the Zurich Information Security and Privacy Center. I founded the company in 2016, and since then we have been growing and growing. Our mission is to become Europe's reference for security analytics, meaning we particularly focus on the needs of European companies, because often, in particular in the finance sector, they are a bit different from what, for example, US companies expect. So in particular, when it comes to where data is processed and so on, there we particularly address these demands. Among our customers, just to also give you a bit an idea, are 2 of the top 5 Swiss banks. PostFinance is one which we are allowed to mention. There are also banks in Austria. So Freebanken IT is a managed provider which is handling them. But we are, for example, also active in the logistics industry. There we also have 2 of the top 5 Swiss logistics companies, and Planzer is one of the companies which I'm allowed to mention. But enough about Exeon. Let's jump into the live hacking, and there our threat analyst Philip Loy will support me. So let me jump to the corresponding screens. Basically, what you can see now on the left side is the attacker's machine. This machine is, as I already said, operated by our threat analyst. And he runs the popular Kali Linux that comes with all kinds of attacker tools. And what we will use today is primarily Metasploit, because that's quite a powerful toolkit, which is freely available. And it allows to nicely demonstrate how such attack works. Then on the right side, you see the victim. In this case, it's a Windows 10 machine. So as first step, the attacker prepares a malicious file that is basically used to infect the Windows machine. We don't show this here to save a bit of time. However, it's actually quite a straightforward process. So typically, for skilled attackers, it takes maybe 5-10 minutes to prepare such a file, which is then basically the malware that is being shipped to the corresponding victim in order to infect the workstation. In this example here, we are going to use a Word document, and via this Word document, we are going to infect the victim. But before we can get started, so before we can provide this malicious document to the victim, we need to make sure that we are basically ready as an attacker, meaning we need to start our command and control server, which will allow us to control this infected workstation the moment the malware has been executed. And basically what Philip is going to do now is to start the corresponding server, which will then be used to control the infected machine. So you can see we are basically setting up a server which will be listening on HTTPS. And like this, the attacker can perfectly hide in between the regular web browsing of users, because it will just be an HTTPS connection that goes to the corresponding server. And this will then be used to control the infected workstation. And you can now see, basically it says we are ready. So the command and control server of the attacker is ready to execute or to take these requests and then also run the commands which the attacker provides. So typically what would happen as next step is that the attackers send the malicious Word file, for example, via email, or also they provide some kind of links which point to the corresponding file. So quite often what attackers do is that they pretend that such a file is the CV of, for example, a potential new employee, or what I also see quite often is that they pretend it's some kind of an invoice which has to be paid. So the result is also the same. Somehow this file is delivered to a user, and the user is going to open it, as I'm going to do right now. So you see here, we already placed it on the desktop. I'm just opening that file now. And basically, there's some kind of a warning saying, yeah, okay, something is weird, but that's it. However, what is important to note is if you look at the left window, right? So the left window is the attacker. And you see the moment I clicked it, basically maybe a second later, there was this message which said that there's a new session open. And this is exactly what I mentioned before. So this is now this hidden command which is now running in the background from the workstation that has been infected to the attacker, and via this hidden command and control channel, the attacker can now control the system. So you see, Philip already run the command sysinfo and get UID, and you can currently just see information about the system that has been compromised. Basically, that's often kind of like the first steps which attackers do, because of course the attacker does not know on which system the attack was successful, and that's why typically they first want to get some background information on the system. As in this example, we now see it's a Windows 10 system and so on. What Philip does next is that he's now basically injecting the malicious code into the Explorer process. Why are we doing that? Because the Explorer process is something which is running all the time. And like this, one can hide really well on the corresponding system. And now you already see that basically the migration has been successful, meaning the malicious code is now running in the context of the Explorer. Now, in order to show you that we are really quite powerful, let's do a simple example where we just take control of the webcam. So basically, we are now enabling the webcam on the compromised machine, and we just take such a snapshot. Usually, this time it didn't work the first time. Sometimes it needs 2 attempts. And I think now we should be able to see the webcam, and indeed that's Philip, our threat analyst, which is of course now sitting in front of the machine and running the corresponding attack. In real life, of course, this would not be the attacker, this would be the victim, but I hope you already see that this whole tool is super powerful because it allows us to enable the webcam, it allows us to access file, so we can really do all kinds of things once we have this hidden command and control channel established between the victim and the attacker. So there's another functionality which is, I would say from attacker's perspective more useful than just enabling the webcam, and that is to record all keystrokes that are being done on the corresponding machine. And this is what Philip just started now. And now let me demonstrate how that works. So I'm just going to open Edge, and I search, for example, for weather in Zurich. Oh, that is English keyboard. And now you can basically see I just run this search query. And now if you look again on the left side, you can basically see what I was typing. So you can even see my typo because I expected to type on a Swiss keyboard, but it was an English one. That's where you see the first characters are switched. And then I corrected myself and typed Zurich correctly. So what you really can see as an attacker now is basically anything which I do via the keyboard. And of course, that's quite a powerful mechanism. I think, only getting information about the weather is not so crucial, right? But it gets more crucial the moment I enter, for example, the master password of my password database. So as you can guess, even though you cannot read what I was entering here, the attacker can, of course, read it. And if you do the dump again, you basically just see, okay, in this case, it was quite a trivial master password, but still the master password is 1234. And what the attackers are doing in practice is, of course, they do not just run that for 2 minutes as we did now. Instead, they typically start that tool and they take maybe a day or even longer. And they basically just collect all kinds of credentials which the user is entering via the keyboard. And for example, assume I just opened this KeyPass1, I entered the password, then the attacker immediately has the master password, and all the attacker needs to do is then just copy away also the corresponding file with the passwords, and then basically the attacker has access to all my accounts because it's the usernames, it's the passwords, and it's also the master key that is required to decrypt the corresponding file. However, this was now more kind of like, I would say, an attack as it can hit any home user. If you are in a corporate environment, often the attackers want to go on and they want to do more. Namely, typically they start on a certain workstation, but they want to spread in the network because they want to access the critical systems, first of all, to steal data, and second, of course, also often to deploy ransomware in the corresponding network. And this is what we're doing right now. So in fact, we are exploiting a vulnerability of a Cisco AnyConnect VPN client that is installed on the system, because this one has a known weakness. And we are now just exploiting that one in order to become a user with root access, so we're an administrative user on the corresponding machine. So this is what just happened now, and Philip just entered the corresponding command. Now you can see again, there's now a second session open, and you can see in that session, we are now basically the system user, meaning we are no longer the user who originally executed the Word document, because that one only had user privileges. Now we are basically an admin user that has full power over the system. And in particular, what this admin user can do is that we can now read the corresponding password database. And that's, of course, the thing attackers often want to achieve. So you see now, we now execute this corresponding commands. This takes a bit of time. And what you're seeing now are basically the accounts and the corresponding password hashes. And even though these are, of course, these are just hashes, more or less one can say these are a bit the keys to the kingdom, if you want to say so. Because if you have these hashes, you can log in on systems in many cases as if you had the corresponding password. So more or less having access to these hashes is in many cases nearly equivalent to having the corresponding user password. And if you combine that with the fact that many organizations use the same administrator password on many systems, this means that with that information, an attacker can now start to spread from this workstation, which was originally infected, through the network towards other systems that have more important data or that are just more important. So typically, these are the Active Directory servers where the attackers try to get access, or of course also just some servers in the production environment, because this is typically where you find the very interesting data, and this is also where you have much more leverage when you deploy your ransomware and encrypt the corresponding systems. Due to time reasons, we are not going to show the corresponding lateral movement. However, I hope you already get an understanding that basically once we have root access to a PC within the organization, and we are able to read the corresponding accounts and the password hashes, basically nothing is stopping us anymore. If the same accounts are present on other systems, we can now just start to spread and move through the network. And that's exactly why such attacks are so powerful, because basically the attackers can now just go on and spread and continue with the corresponding attack. So let me jump back into the slides to give you an idea what typically happens once we are at this point in time. So what we just saw is basically the delivery of the malware. We saw the infection of a workstation. Then we also, I explained the command and control channel. So this hidden communication channel, which was established basically to remotely control this infected client. Then we saw the privilege escalation. So basically, first we were a regular user, and then we became an administrator on the system. And what typically happens next is internal spreading. So basically, the attackers, they spread within the network. Often there's also data theft. So typically, rather large amounts of data are stolen from the corporate network. Often just because the intellectual property is of course of interest. And second, also if the attackers later do a ransomware attack, they can use stolen data as additional leverage to blackmail the company. And important to note is that even though we just now showed the whole attack in kind of a fast forward way, if you want to say so, you have to be aware that usually it takes quite some time. So the attackers, they are often not in a hurry at all. So first they access, for example, such a laptop as we just saw. Then typically they start to collect passwords. Then they start to discover what kind of systems are present and so on. So often we are talking about hours to days until we have internal spreading. And in fact, currently, according to statistics, it takes about 200 days until a company realizes at all that they have been breached. Meaning the attackers, they literally have all the time they need to really move through the network, collect all the data they need, and finally, when they think that they have all the valuable data stolen, they often also deploy a ransomware. Now, the idea of detection and response solutions is, of course, that one can still stop an attack, even though an attacker already managed to infiltrate the workstation. So the idea is that we still have delivery infection. So this is something which should be prevented by the traditional protection measures. However, the moment this happened, we have kind of like a second layer of defense, and that's now detection and response. So the idea is that detection and response will detect that something is going on, and basically an organization can still react, even though there are already attackers inside the IT network. And typically, with network detection response solution like ours, you can detect such an attack within hours. So basically, we can really bring down this more than 200 days to about 1 hour. And this really means, even though attackers are already inside, as an organization, one can prevent that the attackers can really spread, can steal data, and can deploy ransomware. To put that a bit into perspective, also following as a follow-up to Mark's slide, here we see a bit more complete overview. So on the left side, you have the prevention measures. So the prevention measures are the ones which are supposed to keep the attackers out, and they indeed work really well. However, there are just these few cases where they fail, and this is exactly the cases which become very expensive, because this is then when an attacker manages to basically access the network and really attack the network from within, as we just showed in this example. And then the detection response technologies, already as Mark mentioned, are basically three kind of things. It's endpoint detection response, which is ideal for endpoints. And then the area where we are active is basically network detection response, as well as SIEM, or often in the meantime, it's also called XDR. And the idea is that with the network detection response part and with this XDR part, you can basically cover the systems or the parts of the network which are not covered with the endpoint detection response. And as a matter of fact, it's often the case that the most critical systems, there it's often the hardest to deploy the corresponding endpoint detection response agents, because you are often just not allowed to touch them. And this means that the NDR and the SIEM can basically close these holes, and they can basically protect the parts of the network which are often most crucial. To give you a bit of understanding what is typically contained or what one needs to do. So we distinguish between visibility, which basically means just to visualize and show what's happening in network. Then detection is the second aspect. This is basically triggering alerts in case something goes wrong. And then, of course, response, which means that basically one takes the events, one makes them available to an analyst as well as to other systems via REST APIs, such that one can really act based on the detected incidents. The kind of technologies which we are using for that are, on the one hand, supervised and unsupervised machine learning. It's also predefined expert use cases, because as Mark also mentioned, it's often quite hard to implement the use cases in traditional SIEM solution, and it helps a lot if one basically just gets a solution which contains it all and can basically just feed the data, and then one doesn't have to take care of the use cases. Further, it's also that we work with a lot of visualizations, because what we realized is that many organizations, they really struggle to understand what's in their network. And if you don't know what's in the network, you can also not really protect it. And then the third aspect, which is, in our opinion, very important one, is that we do the whole analysis using a graph database. So this sounds a bit like a technical detail. However, it's crucial when it comes to scalability, because often one needs to analyze billions of events, and this simply doesn't scale if you do it in a traditional fashion and try to correlate raw logs. So instead, one really needs to aggregate the data in order to make them searchable and in order to use them for analysis. So let me quickly show how such a corresponding detection can look like. For this, I just show you 2 pages in our tool. And what I'm showing you here is basically not exactly what we just saw in the demonstration, because it would be trivial to detect that, because it was a small network, and also this Metasploit command and control channel is very noisy, so it's really easy to detect it. Instead, I'm showing you a bit more difficult case where we also have an HTTP-based command and control channel. However, we also have background traffic, such that it's not so easy to detect it. And this is actually a real malware sample which accessed the domain vipyandex.com as a command and control channel. Here you can see the corresponding alerts, and I just quickly want to show you how that looks like, or basically what happened. This is what you can basically see here. So this is now this first web request which was used to register the infected workstation. So you can see here, that's basically just this URL. Then there's a host ID, there's a host name, and there's quite a lot of meta information. And that's now very similar to what we saw before. So basically, the moment the malware is executed, that's the kind of request which is being used to register the malware with the attacker. And then later, if I just select one of these, you can basically see that now the request that we see is basically just, it says action get command, and it again contains this host ID, which was registered before. And that's basically now just the requests which the malware uses to check whether there are new actions available that should be executed on the infected workstation. And now that I'm showing it to you like this, I guess it's quite easy to understand, okay, that something weird is going on, but you have to be aware that in a regular IT environment, these kind of requests, they are hidden among millions to billions of regular activities. And that's why it's infeasible to find these kind of things without machine learning support. Because otherwise, as an analyst, you would really just have to look at all these entries, which is absolutely not feasible. And that's why one can really say that machine learning allows to find a bit the needle in a haystack. So one can really find these suspicious requests among millions to billions of regular activities. So let me come to the end of my demonstration. One last thing which I wanted to mention is just how we differentiate from other customers. How we differentiate from other vendors. So, and these are, of course, also the reasons why the customers choose us. So the first reason is that we are a hardware-less network detection and response system. Meaning, instead of using hardware sensors that are mirroring, that receive copies of traffic and are basically analyzing the traffic, we just work on log data that is exported, for example, by proxy servers or by switches or by firewalls. Second, we have these functionalities to combine the network view with application and system logs. Meaning we can basically combine the two things, and like this we get the complete kind of a bird's view from the network perspective, and we can enhance that with application system logs, and this basically allows us to take over the functionalities which are usually solved with a traditional SIEM. Further, we have a future-proof solution, because the solution is explicitly built for encrypted networks. Meaning what we do is we do not try to inspect payload, because that's anyway no longer possible with encrypted networks. Instead, we inspect metadata and basically do a behavior-based analysis using metadata. And another, in my opinion, very important point is that we are a European vendor. And as I mentioned before, we explicitly built the solution for the requirements of Swiss or also European customers in the finance sector. And just to give a concrete example, this means, for example, that typically the solution just runs on-site with the customer, and we do not send any data to the outside. So there's just a simple requirement which usually one must fulfill, which many other solutions don't, because often they have quite a tight integration with some kind of a vendor cloud. That's it for my part. And now, Mark, I would suggest let's summarize the key takeaways of today. And I think the first points are from your side, so the floor is yours.
Thanks again, David. For today, a bit of a key takeaway is what I call create cyber readiness. And cyber readiness means so much is that you are aware that you can be attacked as a company, and you make sure that you spend some effort on getting ready. And there are a lot of things to do, and you don't need to build that whole infrastructure of monitoring. You can do a lot of things in advance to start thinking about it and do the bare minimums in order to help yourself and get more ready for cyber attacks. Because it's not a question of if you get attacked, you will be attacked one day, especially if you don't do so much.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Next point, I think that one is also from your side.
Yeah, definitely. What I like to do in order to get a good scope of your security program is use a risk-based approach. And that means that you know what your key assets are, what your core of your business is to protect. And you don't need to protect things that doesn't impact your business if it gets stolen or if it gets hacked. But if your core application, your core business gets impacted by a cyber attack, you want to make sure that you spend your money over there. And from that point out, you can make the steps in order to be protective and be detective and responsive to it.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Next point, I think that's also from you.
Yeah, this is my lovely one. The easiest way, and it sounds very easy, to be more ready and more cyber ready is that you patch your infrastructure, patch your Microsoft system. Microsoft brings out every Tuesday their monthly Tuesday, Patch Tuesday, that patches for all the infrastructure components from them. Do the patching over there because it helps you to be resilient. And it sounds easy. It's sometimes a bit harder to get it achieved, as sometimes your business doesn't want to allow you to bring the system down to do patching. But patching is the simplest way to increase your maturity on security.
Next point, I brought that one up because it's something I get asked quite often by customers. Because quite often customers say, okay, yeah, if you talk about ransomware, we have backups in place. And then my question is usually great, because some companies, they don't even have backups. However, what is very important, in my opinion, is also that one tests the restoring of the backups. So in fact, what I typically recommend is that one just does it as kind of an exercise. For example, at least every quarter or maybe every year, but that one really does this kind of drills where engineers have to recover services from backups, because if you never test it until you really need it, you are going to have the backups, but nobody can ever guarantee that you can release the backups. And I think it's also a good routine just for the engineers to basically regularly use the backups, restore services from them, because then it's also not such a special thing to do. And usually it's just good to train things in advance before you really need them. Next point, I think, is also from you, Mark, right?
Yeah, where I didn't touch on was the trend that a lot of companies go into the cloud, and even the banks go into cloud. And that shifts a little bit the focus on how you do security over there. It makes it a little bit complex, especially if you have both environments, on-premise and cloud solutions. But in the cloud, if you want to do security monitoring over there, if you want to be secure, you need to think about identity management, where in the traditional setup of on-premise, we think about defending the perimeter, having firewalls, having intrusion detection systems over there, and monitor that. in a cloud solution, that doesn't work anymore. So you need to make sure that you have a very good setup of managing identities, cleaning them up, splitting the functions and the access, especially the high privileged access accounts over there. Don't mix that up too much. In cloud, that identity management is a crucial factor of being safe.
Thanks. Next one is from my side. And basically the message is quite simple. One must understand what the assets are. And it sounds simple, but in fact it's not, because often corporate networks, they consist of 10,000s of devices if we are in a larger network. And what we realize that it's often customers struggle a lot with really getting an understanding of what is actually inside their network. And there the challenge is, of course, if you don't really know what's inside the network, then it's also really hard to protect it. And I think that's why it's really key that one understands what's inside the own IT infrastructure, such that one can avoid shadow IT risks. And I think the last point is also from my side. Basically, what we often see, and I think there one also needs to change a bit the way how one approaches security, is that still there are quite a lot of companies which invest quite a lot in protection solutions. So the kind of technologies which are supposed to keep the attackers outside. However, as also Mark mentioned today, it's just the fact that for most companies, at some point, they will be hacked, because it's just a cat and mouse game, and the attackers really have the advantage when it comes to circumventing protection solutions, because there just needs to be a single hole somewhere in this whole protection framework, and then the attackers are inside. And I think that's why it's, in my opinion, just really crucial that one really prepares for a potential compromise. And I think a very important aspect of preparing is to monitor basically the network, the cloud, and of course also what is now becoming more and more popular, also SaaS applications. Because the issue is if you don't really monitor what's happening on these assets, then attackers can just conduct their attacks, and they have a lot of time, and you will not realize until it's too late. And that's why, I think really monitoring is a key, because otherwise one is just blind and cannot react to corresponding attacks. That was already the last point on our list. And now we would jump into questions. And in fact, there has been quite some activity in the chat. So give me a bit of time. I'm going to go through them, and then we will answer them. One question is this session going to be recorded? Yes, it is. And we will also make it available to the people who registered for the webinar. Another question was about the attack. The question was, does Keyscan collect clipboard data as well? So Keyscan was a tool which we used in order to record what I was typing during the attack. As far as I know, it doesn't. However, if I'm not mistaken, there are similar tools in the Metasploit or Kali framework, which one could use to also get access to the clipboard. Then one more question, I think that one is sort of towards you, Mark, is what would you expect? So we had now before Christmas, we had the SolarWinds or the Sunburst attack, right? Then beginning of the year we had the MS Exchange major security issue. Do you see, or any reasons why we just hand out 2 of them, or would you say that's going to be the new normal, or what is a bit your take on?
It's partly a new normal. It is also partly that we get more visibility on these kind of things. And definitely the SolarWinds and the last one with Microsoft Exchange were very sophisticated attacks, probably nation state organized, and that is very hard to defend from. But you see also more and more in the news that you read about ransomwares of companies, and it gets more traction over there, it gets more attention. The bad news is indeed that these things happen more often. The good news is that there is created more awareness by the fact that it comes to the news and it comes to the public. And that means that people are aware that they need to have a security program, that they need to work on their state of security and defending their own companies. So I cannot look in the future, unfortunately, else I must be very rich, I guess. But I would expect that these kind of SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange hacks, you will see them in the future, and rather more than less, because it's not stopping from the criminal side. They get more and more opportunities because more people go to IT, go into cloud, and they will use it. And as long as criminals are get paid by that and earn money on that way, it will exist.
Thanks a lot. That was interesting. Then there was one more question regarding our Extreme Trace software. And here the question was, if I summarize it, did we just detect it because Kali and Metasploit are like popular frameworks, and that's why we could build some fingerprints? Or and then of course the follow-up, what would happen if there was a less popular attack? Would we still detect it? And the reason is, what we do is we do not work with fingerprints of known attacks. Instead, what our software does is the machine learning, the supervised as well as the unsupervised one, in fact, learns what is normal. So either we train in the lab what, for example, normal web browsing is, or the algorithms learn it on-site with the customer, how the device normally behave. And that's why what we do detect, in fact, is not that we are searching for a certain malware and we look for fingerprints, a bit similar to traditional antivirus or IDS. Instead, what we detect are deviations from the normal patterns that the software knows. And that's why the software can also detect novel attacks. In fact, what was very interesting is that we reconstructed the sunburst attack, which was just mentioned in our lab, and the software was able to detect it using a machine learning model that we trained 2 years ago. And of course, 2 years ago, we had no idea how this attack would exactly look like. And the reason why the software was able to do that is because it's not looking for certain malicious patterns. Instead, it's looking for things which deviate from the normal behavior learned before. And that's how the software could, for example, detect the corresponding sunburst attack. I'm looking at my watch, and I think we are already above the hour. However, let me check if there are still more questions. Maybe a last one for you, Mark. Since I was mentioning Europe before, and as we said, we also have a bit European approach, but of course, there are many cybersecurity players in the US. What would you say is when it comes to being ready for cyber attacks, are European companies a bit behind the US ones, or is it about the same, or what would you say? Since you are European yourself, I think maybe you also have to be a bit self-critical. So what would you say?
I think if you take a look at what are the top players in cybersecurity and who are the most advanced ones, that are probably the ones that are the most attacked. I think the US is part of that, but they're not the top runners. My top three would be Israel, because they got so many attacks over there. The whole Gulf region, so the oil producing countries over there, especially with Iran in the neighborhood, they got very lot of attacks, and they spend an awful lot of money on cybersecurity. And you see that probably in all the open positions over there where you can go there if you want to live there. And they are quite mature in their security posture. And definitely the US is also attacked, especially the banks over there. They got a lot of attacks on DDoS. And the more attacks you receive, the more time and the more pressure is there to mature your security. From a regulator perspective, from the company itself, of course. So that will grow maturity. So I don't want to see it as a competition, but I think these are the three spots that are more ahead of the rest, where definitely in Europe you see also a growing attention to improve the state of security of companies, and where traditionally the banks were front running that and they were forced by regulations. You see also now that as soon as the attackers go to focus a bit more on hospitals and universities, and they're successful over there, we need to pay attention to these type of organizations also to protect them. So it comes a little bit with the amount of attacks you have to mature, and that depends a bit on the type of attacks.
Great, thanks a lot, Mark. I think that was an excellent answer to complete our session. Are there any last words from your side, Mark?
No, I would like to thank all the attendees who listened to this. If there are any questions left towards me, at least I can speak for myself. You see here the LinkedIn and my email address. Send an email. I will answer your questions if you have anything left, even if it comes later. I'm fine to support anyone, because I want to use my experience to strengthen the whole community and not only one bank.
Thanks a lot. Also a very warm thank you from my side. It's great to see that so many attendees also stayed till the end. And have a great rest of the week. And for sure, our next webinar will be coming soon. Thanks a lot and have a good day. Bye.
Thanks. Cheers.